as she was never coming back. Not because the kidnapper changed his mind, not because the ransom went unpaid, and not because the negotiations failed. The truth was far more chilling. There had never been a kidnapper holding Nancy Guthrie somewhere in the first place. There were no real negotiations taking place. No transaction waiting to be completed. Because the truth was, the kidnapping had never happened at all. And what actually happened is something that 6 weeks of federal investigation, more than 400 assigned investigators, and over 55,000 tips never fully stated out loud. It is the truth that every documentary, every news segment, and every discussion about this case has circled around without ever confronting it directly. But there is no reason to keep circling anymore. Because when you stop repeating the familiar narrative and start looking at the evidence itself, a very different picture begins to appear. Not the version written in the headlines. Not the story suggested by the ransom notes. Not the scenario the kidnapping theory forced everyone to accept. Instead, the answer lies in the confirmed physical evidence. The blood, the DNA, the forensic pathology, and the behavioral analysis presented by some of the most experienced law enforcement experts who examined this case. And when all of that evidence is viewed without forcing it to fit the kidnapping story, it begins to reveal something far more unsettling, a reality the original narrative was never designed to hold. And Nancy Guthrie was not kidnapped. What truly happened unfolded during those 41 minutes of darkness on that front porch. Something violent took place there, something that had already ended long before any ransom notes were ever written. And in the 6 weeks that followed, someone worked carefully to redirect the world's attention somewhere else. Toward a Bitcoin wallet, toward a ticking deadline, toward a payment that never came. The deadline passed without a single dollar moving, and more importantly, without a single piece of proof that Nancy Guthrie was still alive. Because proof of life requires one simple thing: a living person. And the evidence has been quietly pointing to that reality since February 1st, even while the kidnapping narrative made it nearly impossible for anyone to say it out loud. So now it has to be said. From the beginning, the public was given a frame, and every news segment, every expert panel, every social media debate about this case has operated inside that same assumption. That someone took Nancy Guthrie alive and was simply waiting for money. But that assumption is exactly why the evidence never seemed to fit. Inside that frame, the ransom notes should have led somewhere. Inside that frame, proof of life should have arrived within the first 48 hours. Inside that frame, the blood found on the front porch becomes an awkward detail, something that must be explained away to keep the kidnapping story intact. Yet when you stop forcing the evidence to support that narrative, the pieces begin to point toward something far more troubling than a kidnapping still in progress. But what if the entire frame of this case is wrong? What if the kidnapping was never the real story at all, but simply the story everyone was meant to believe? For 6 weeks, federal investigators have followed that narrative. More than 400 investigators assigned, over 55,000 tips reviewed, and a $1 million reward offered to find a living hostage. Yet what if all of that effort has been directed toward a version of events that was constructed after the fact, designed to push law enforcement to keep looking forward, toward a supposed kidnapper and a ransom, instead of looking backward at what may have already happened? This is not speculation created behind a microphone. It reflects the analytical conclusions reached by two of the most experienced and highly credentialed law enforcement experts who have publicly examined the case. And when you hear their full analysis, not the simplified version that appeared in headlines, you begin to understand why the kidnapping narrative does not just contain a few inconsistencies. The deeper you look, the more it seems to collapse entirely. But before the theories and before the expert conclusions, there are the basic facts. Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, the mother of Savannah Guthrie, the co-anchor of NBC's Today Show. She lived alone on a secluded residential property in the Catalina foothills outside Tucson, Arizona. According to Sheriff Chris Nanos, she was mentally sharp and alert, but physically limited, relying on daily cardiac medication and living a quiet, routine life, until the night everything changed. And Nancy Guthrie lived with constant medical monitoring. A pacemaker transmitted her heart rhythm wirelessly to her medical team, quietly tracking every beat. On the evening of January 31st, her family drove her home after dinner. At 9:50 p.m., the garage door closed behind her. After that, the neighborhood settled into silence. Hours passed with nothing unusual, until 1:47 a.m., when her doorbell camera suddenly went offline. This was not a technical glitch and not a power outage. The device itself had been physically removed. Investigators later determined that a masked individual had approached the camera, taken it off its mount, and deliberately covered the lens with vegetation before disconnecting it. This was not the action of someone improvising in the moment. It suggested preparation. Whoever did it already knew the camera existed, had anticipated it, and disabled it as part of a deliberate sequence of steps. The camera was not an obstacle discovered that night. It was a problem that had been planned for in advance. Then came the final timestamp. At 2:28 a.m., Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker monitoring app lost its Bluetooth connection to her phone. From the moment the camera was disabled to the moment the medical signal disappeared, only 41 minutes had passed. That narrow window, just 41 minutes, is the entire confirmed timeline investigators have for the crime. And within that short span, on the front porch of the home where Nancy had lived for 5 decades, investigators discovered something that would change the entire direction of the case. Blood. The blood was not found inside the house. It was on the front porch. DNA testing later confirmed it belonged to Nancy Guthrie. When forensic pathologist Dr. Michael Baden examined photographs of the stains, he focused on a very specific detail in their shape. Each drop had a pale center, what specialists often describe as a donut pattern. This kind of pattern typically appears when blood falls from the nose or mouth, because air mixes with the blood as it drops, leaving that distinctive hollow center. His assessment was direct and unambiguous. The pattern of those drops, he explained, was entirely consistent with a violent struggle occurring during an abduction. In other words, something sudden and forceful happened to Nancy Guthrie on that porch. Something strong enough to cause bleeding from her face or nose. And according to the timeline investigators established, it all happened within that same narrow 41-minute window. Keep that image in mind for a moment, the blood on the porch. Because nearly every question in this case eventually leads back to that detail. Now consider something simple. If you had taken someone and were holding them alive, if you intended to demand $6 million in Bitcoin, your entire plan would depend on one thing: communication. And the first question becomes obvious. Who would you contact? The answer does not require investigators, laboratories, or expert testimony. It is the most predictable step in any real kidnapping. In a real kidnapping, the process is straightforward. The person responsible reaches out to the family quietly and directly. There has to be a channel, something simple and private, a phone number, an email address, some clear way to communicate. Because a ransom is a transaction. Money moves in one direction, a person moves in the other. Two sides must be able to talk for that exchange to ever happen. Without that connection, the entire structure collapses. And yet, that is exactly what was missing in this case. Instead of contacting the family privately, the first ransom message appeared somewhere else entirely, sent to TMZ and to 2 television stations in Tucson. Not a negotiation channel, but a broadcast platform. A place where a message instantly becomes public news. The note demanded $6 million in Bitcoin. It referenced specific details about Nancy Guthrie's Apple Watch and her home. It even included a strict deadline. But one critical element was missing. There was no return address, no phone number, no email, no instructions for how the family could respond. And that detail changes everything. Because a ransom note without a way to respond is not truly a ransom note. Read that carefully. A ransom note with no return address is not a ransom note, it is a performance of one. It suggests someone who understood what a kidnapping story is supposed to look like, someone familiar with the language and the drama of these crimes. But in writing the script, they overlooked the most important part. A real ransom story requires a second act, a way for the negotiation to begin. In any real kidnapping, the next step after a ransom demand is negotiation. And negotiation only works if both sides have a way to communicate. There must be a channel, some way for the family to respond, ask questions, or arrange payment. But in this case, that channel never existed. Because the person who wrote those messages does not appear to have been preparing for a negotiation at all. What they were preparing for was a disappearance. A look closely at what those notes actually accomplished. They did not provide a path for Nancy Guthrie to come home. Instead, they created a narrative, one the public could easily follow. The messages pushed investigators, the media, and the entire country to focus on the idea of a living hostage and a Bitcoin ransom. In doing so, they redirected attention away from what had already happened on that front porch and turned it into a story that seemed unfinished, something that still might be resolved. Even experienced analysts noticed the difference. CNN's chief law enforcement analyst, John Miller, avoided calling them traditional ransom notes. Instead, he described them as something else entirely, a one-way conversation. And a one-way conversation is not negotiation. It is simply a declaration. Statements like that are usually written by people who have no intention of bargaining. And that brings us to someone whose perspective carries serious weight in cases like this. Her name is Tracy Walder. She is not a media personality or a podcast host filling airtime. Before speaking publicly about cases like this one, she spent years working as an FBI special agent in counterterrorism, analyzing threats, behavior patterns, and the logic behind criminal actions. After her time with the FBI, Tracy Walder moved into work with the CIA, continuing her career in areas of intelligence that rarely become public. Her professional focus was built around one discipline: understanding how violent actors plan crimes meant to intimidate, manipulate, or control. When this case first broke, she appeared on News Nation and made a point that should have received far more attention than it did. Walder stated clearly that she did not believe this was a burglary that had simply gone wrong. That detail matters because, in mid-February, a local Arizona television station reported, citing an unnamed inside source, that investigators were quietly considering exactly that scenario, a break-in that escalated unexpectedly. But that narrative did not last long. Within hours, the Pima County Sheriff's Department issued a direct response. Their statement left little room for interpretation. They had never described the case as a burglary gone wrong, and any reports suggesting otherwise were inaccurate. The FBI reinforced that clarification. Walder's reasoning was practical and based on experience. In the real world of criminal behavior, burglars are looking for valuables, not hostages. They break in to take property, and they leave. They do not take people with them. In a typical burglary, the objective is straightforward: get in quickly, take valuables, and leave before anyone notices. But taking a person with you, especially an 84-year-old woman with limited mobility and a pacemaker, completely changes that equation. It slows everything down. It increases risk, noise, and exposure. What began as a simple property crime suddenly becomes a federal kidnapping case, one that carries the possibility of a life sentence. Experienced criminals understand that difference. They do not stumble into a decision like that by accident. Tracy Walder also raised another point that shifts how this entire case might be understood. In her assessment, the motive may not have been about Nancy Guthrie herself. Instead, she suggested the crime could be connected to someone far more visible: her daughter, Savannah Guthrie. According to Walder, the act could stem from obsession or retaliation. Two very different motives, but both leading to the same conclusion. The target may have been symbolic rather than direct. And when someone cannot easily reach a public figure, they sometimes look for another way to send a message. The most painful way to do that is rarely through the public figure themselves. It is through someone they care about deeply. A family member. Someone whose life is quieter and more predictable. Someone whose address can be found, whose daily routines can be observed, and whose home sits in an ordinary neighborhood without the layers of protection that often surround people in the spotlight. Nancy Guthrie was never a random victim. Everything about this case suggests intention. She appears to have been chosen deliberately, a message directed at a very specific person. According to investigators, the crime itself may have been prepared over the course of nearly 30 days, only to unfold in a brief window of just 41 minutes under the cover of darkness. One of the people who analyzed the case in depth is John Miller, CNN's chief law enforcement and intelligence analyst. His background is difficult to ignore. Before joining CNN, he served as the NYPD's Deputy Commissioner for Intelligence and Counterterrorism. Earlier in his career, he worked as an assistant director at the FBI and held senior roles within U.S. national intelligence. Over the years, his journalism and investigative work have earned 2 Peabody Awards and 11 Emmy Awards. When he released a detailed analysis of the case at the 1-month mark, one particular word in his explanation stood out, and it deserves careful attention. Miller suggested that the incident might have begun as a planned home invasion that went disastrously wrong, and that what followed was something very different. His exact wording was that the crime may have been re-engineered into a kidnapping for ransom after the suspect's situation changed. That term matters. Not continued, not escalated, not simply adjusted, re-engineered. The implication is striking. The crime eventually presented to the public may not have been the original plan at all, but a new narrative constructed after the fact. That interpretation suggests something critical. It implies that after whatever happened during those 41 minutes, after the blood appeared on the porch, after the plan collided with reality, the person responsible made a decision. But that decision was not about what to do next with Nancy. It was about what story the world would be told about Nancy. The ransom notes, in that context, begin to look very different. They do not read like messages from someone who actually had her. They read like messages written by someone who needed everyone else to believe they did. Consider the operational logic behind that move. If the original plan collapsed on that porch, if the crime ended in a way that was never supposed to happen or be seen, then creating a kidnapping narrative would be an incredibly powerful diversion. A kidnapping story does more than confuse investigators. It redirects the entire public conversation. News coverage shifts toward the search for a living hostage. Tips from the public begin pointing outward, toward suspects, locations, and ransom demands. Every available resource starts chasing the possibility that someone, somewhere, is still holding her. And meanwhile, the physical evidence remains exactly where the event began. On that porch. John Miller pointed to that detail with unusual clarity in his analysis. According to him, the central factor, the element that everything else revolves around, is the blood outside the front door. Because that evidence does not suggest a crime still unfolding somewhere else. It suggests something decisive already happened at the very beginning. The blood on that porch tells a story of its own. It suggests that whatever this crime was originally supposed to be, the plan began falling apart almost immediately. That blood is not a minor detail, and it is not background evidence. It is a signal that something went wrong the moment events reached the front door. Whatever preparation may have taken place over the previous 30 days did not unfold the way it was intended. Instead, the situation appears to have changed abruptly, right there, in the first moments of contact. And if that moment altered everything, then much of what followed may have been constructed afterward. That leads to a question the kidnapping narrative has never been able to fully explain. Over 6 weeks of public appeals, through emotional videos from Savannah Guthrie, through media interviews, reward announcements, and direct messages pleading with whoever might have taken her mother, not a single piece of proof has ever been presented showing that Nancy Guthrie was alive. No photograph. No audio recording. Not even a short note written in her own hand. In documented kidnapping cases where ransom is demanded, proof of life typically appears very quickly, often within hours. Not because kidnappers feel sympathy, but because proof of life is their only real leverage. Without it, the demand loses its power. Without it, the family has no reason to believe a payment will bring their loved one back. Without proof of life, a ransom demand has no foundation. The entire structure depends on one central assumption, that the person being ransomed is alive and can be returned. Remove that assumption, and the demand collapses. Yet throughout 6 weeks of messages and public attention, the person behind those notes never once provided any evidence that Nancy Guthrie was alive. Not once. Despite repeated communications, despite a family pleading publicly for even the smallest sign that their mother was still breathing somewhere, nothing ever appeared. Federal investigators eventually confirmed the same reality. By mid-February, the FBI acknowledged they were aware of no ongoing communication between the Guthrie family and anyone claiming to be a kidnapper. No active dialogue. No proof of life. No negotiation taking place. Because a real negotiation requires two participants, and in this case, one side of that exchange never actually existed. At one point, Savannah Guthrie stood before cameras and spoke words that carried a weight many people may not have noticed at the time. She said, "We also know that she may be lost. She may already be gone." That is not the language of someone who has been assured their mother is alive somewhere in captivity. It sounds more like the words of someone who has been carefully briefed by investigators. Someone being prepared for the possibility that proof of life never arrived because it was never possible to provide it. Some facts in this case stand apart from speculation or theory. They come directly from the physical evidence investigators have confirmed. Among the most significant discoveries were two separate DNA profiles connected to the crime. One was recovered from a glove found roughly 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home, a glove that appeared visually consistent with the ones worn by the masked individual seen in the doorbell footage. The second DNA profile came from biological material collected inside the residence itself. The Pima County Sheriff's Office addressed this point clearly. There are two distinct DNA profiles involved, indicating two different individuals. Neither profile matches anyone in the Guthrie family, and neither currently matches any entry in CODIS, the FBI's national database of convicted offenders. The presence of two unidentified individuals changes the nature of the crime entirely. A situation involving two participants rarely points to a spontaneous act. It does not resemble a burglary that suddenly spiraled out of control. It suggests something coordinated. When two people are involved, planning becomes necessary. Roles must be assigned, timing must be agreed upon, and both individuals must trust the other enough to carry out the plan. According to the FBI's description, the masked figure captured in the footage appeared to be a male standing around 5 feet 9 inches to 5 feet 10 inches, with an average build and dark facial hair. Former FBI profiler Jim Clemente also noted what may be an identifying detail: a possible wrist tattoo briefly visible in the small gap between the glove and the sleeve. Jim Clemente's observation about the possible wrist tattoo was not a casual remark. His statement was carefully worded. If forensic analysis confirms that marking, it could become a powerful identifier, something capable of immediately narrowing or even eliminating potential suspects. Former FBI profilers do not highlight details like that publicly unless they understand investigators are already comparing that feature against specific individuals under consideration. At the same time, another investigative process has been unfolding quietly in the background. For the past 4 weeks, genealogical DNA analysis has been running on both unidentified profiles recovered in the case. This is the same technique that ultimately led to the identification of the Golden State Killer decades after his crimes. Investigators use partial DNA matches from large commercial genealogy databases, building family trees step by step, branch by branch, tracing connections through distant relatives who voluntarily uploaded their genetic information, often without realizing how those databases might one day be used. Statistically, the odds that both contributors to the DNA evidence have managed to keep every relative out of those massive databases are extremely small. The science continues moving forward regardless of the narratives surrounding the case. It does not rely on ransom messages or public speculation. It simply follows the genetic trail wherever it leads. And when all of the confirmed evidence is considered together, one conclusion begins to stand out clearly. The facts do not align with the idea of a kidnapping still in progress. And when all the pieces are placed together, the evidence points toward a different timeline than the one most people were given. It suggests a crime that may have already been finished before the ransom notes ever appeared. Something seems to have gone wrong almost immediately. On that front porch, around 2 in the morning, the blood left behind formed patterns that a forensic pathologist described as entirely consistent with a physical struggle. And the individuals responsible appear to have left behind something else as well. DNA evidence from 2 separate people, now preserved in federal case files and actively being analyzed through genealogical databases that are designed to eventually produce real identities. Analysts examining the case have reached similar interpretations from different angles. Tracy Walder argued that the circumstances feel far too targeted to be random. In her view, the motive may be personal. possibly tied to Savannah Guthrie's public world and the people who follow it closely. John Miller approached the case from another perspective, describing the situation as re-engineered, suggesting the narrative may have shifted after the original plan collapsed at the front door. In that light, the ransom notes begin to look less like the start of the crime and more like an attempt to reshape what had already gone wrong. None of this means a final conclusion has officially been declared. Authorities have not confirmed that Nancy Guthrie is dead, and her family continues to hold on to the hope that she may still be alive. The investigation remains active, and the public tip line is still open. But one point remains unavoidable. When the confirmed evidence is examined on its own, without forcing it into the familiar kidnapping narrative, it begins to tell a story that is very different from the one many people were first led to believe. And the evidence has never fully aligned with the story the public was first given. In fact, two of the most experienced law enforcement voices to analyze this case have quietly pointed toward the same possibility from different angles. Their conclusions are measured and careful, but the implication is difficult to ignore. The kidnapping may not be the central crime at all. Instead, it may be the narrative built around it, the explanation meant to frame what people believe happened. And because the real focus of this case may lie elsewhere. It may lie in those 41 minutes on a front porch in the early hours of the morning. That is where Nancy Guthrie's blood was discovered, forming the kind of drop patterns forensic pathologists often associate with bleeding from the face during a physical struggle. Something happened there. Something sudden, something violent, and something that may never have been intended to leave visible evidence behind. Yet for the past 6 weeks, the public's attention has been pulled in another direction. Toward a Bitcoin ransom, toward deadlines, toward the idea of a negotiation that never actually took place. And what remains now is the search for the truth. Nancy Guthrie deserves that truth, and so do her children, Savannah, Cameron, and Annie, who have stood before cameras asking for answers while holding on to hope. The investigation continues, but the physical evidence is already speaking in its own way. The blood, the DNA recovered from two separate individuals, and the genealogical analysis currently tracing those profiles through family connections. Step by step, that process moves closer to something every unresolved case eventually seeks: a name. Investigators are not relying on a single lead. Cell tower records and digital activity stretching back nearly 8 months are already forming a trail, one that appears to be narrowing toward a specific door. And when that door finally opens, it is unlikely to do so quietly. If you know anything at all about this case, even something that once seemed insignificant, now is the time to share it. The FBI tip line, 1-800-CALL-FBI, remains active, and every detail could matter more than it seems. The one piece that changes everything might already exist in someone's memory, tied to a moment from weeks ago that never quite made sense. If you have been following this case, join the discussion. Share where you are watching from and what you believe may have happened during those 41 minutes on that porch. Communities that analyze cases like this often notice patterns and details long before they are widely recognized. Your perspective might connect a piece of the puzzle someone else overlooked. And if you want to stay updated as new developments appear, follow along and keep notifications on, because the turning point in this case may not be far away. The answer may come from something as precise as a genealogical DNA match, a confirmed cell tower location, or a single person deciding that silence is no longer worth protecting. When that moment arrives, the scattered pieces of this story could suddenly align around one name, a name investigators may already be closing in on. Because the narrative of a kidnapping may never have been the true story. The real events may have already taken place, inside a window of just 41 minutes.